What's up, everybody? Welcome into the Pack a Day podcast. I'm your host, Andy Herman. Thanks so much for taking some time to join me today. And as what's more than likely going to be the case over the remainder of this month, today I'm going to be talking about the NFL draft, but I'm not going to be doing it in maybe the way that you probably expected logging in today if you're a repeat listener. For those of you who don't know me, or even if you do, I love the NFL draft. It is one of my absolute favorite things. And by the way, I should probably get this out of the way now because you'll see why in just a moment. But the Cheesehead TV draft guide just launched. I covered the cornerback group for this year's draft. My top 30 corners are in there, breakdowns, how they fit with the Packers, that and so much more. There's a tremendous, amazing group of people that has supported that and been a part of that. So make sure to check that out if you haven't already. It is worth supporting for the people who have done the amazing work on it. So definitely make sure to check that out. And if you're a Packer fan looking for draft coverage, there's no better place to get it where you're actually getting it from a Packer perspective. So let me say that first, because what I'm going to go over next may, reverse some of that a little bit. So my topic of discussion today is what NFL teams know about the draft that we as fans, analysts, etc., wherever you want to categorize yourself as, what we don't know. And this is actually an article that I wrote for Packer Report last year, right before the draft. And I think it's really important to go over. And this is probably going to become a yearly tradition where I either do something either in written or, on the podcast or something, because I think it's worth mentioning, because right now we are inundated with 24/7 draft coverage from every angle. Literally everyone becomes a draft expert this time of year. There's varying degrees of people who know stuff, who don't know stuff, who have been trained on how to scout players, who have not been trained, people who are looking at highlight videos versus people who are looking at all 22 film. And there is just a ton of information to try to sort through, where we get mock drafts, we get big boards, we get player profiles, we get player interviews, we get everything. And it's great. I absolutely love it. And I know, it's the draft industrial complex or whatever, but I love every second of it. And it's going back. This is literally a true story. And I usually post this picture around draft time. There's a picture of me at 9 years old in my basement, and I've got pads of paper. I've literally got like a full draft board. There's one draft, I think it was actually the year after the picture, where like I had like these big cardboard, like I basically had like draft boards up of like my top prospects. That was at age 9. And I know it was age 9 because I remember very vividly, and this is my naivety at age 9, and this is a very embarrassing story in hindsight, but I wanted Green Bay in that draft to draft Garrison Hurst. And I don't even remember. I think Garrison Hurst was expected to be a top 5 pick, and Green Bay was probably picking well later than that. But I wanted Green Bay to get Garrison Hurst. And I remember the Press Gazette had, at the time, there was an advertisement in it for the Packers NFL Draft Hotline. And I remember very vividly calling up very excited to the Packers Draft Hotline to see if the Packers were going to trade up for Garrison Hurst, because they would tell me, of course. And of course, this was like some poor intern working at the Green Bay Press Gazette. And I remember so vividly, they're like holding back just pure anger and frustration for, I'm sure, the people that were calling that day. And they just said, at this time, we have no information of any trades the Packers have made. And that was literally it. And it was beyond amazing. But it has been something that has been a passion and a love of mine for, since I was 9 years old, and I've ever since. And I could go on with other lame memories that you don't care about, but I absolutely love the draft process. And I think, for anyone who is a fan of TV shows like Westworld or Lost or WandaVision, Game of Thrones, anything like that. Like, for anyone that loves reading like all the theories of what could happen, like, to me, that stuff is almost as fun, if not more fun, than the actual show itself, of thinking of like, all right, what could happen next and who could show up here and what might they do? And like, all of that is just like going down the rabbit hole, and I love every second of it. If you've ever been a wrestling fan and fantasy booked a match, or what a pay-per-view card would look like, or what tag team or faction you'd like to see together, and for years it was Sting versus Undertaker, which I can't believe has never happened, but that's all part of it. Like, that part of it, being a wrestling fan, is almost more fun a lot of times than the matches in and of themselves. If you've ever played fantasy football, completed franchises on Madden while doing franchise drafts, or run mock draft simulators, at the variety of sites that now have them, it's all part of putting yourself in that mindset. And the journey, to me, is greater than the end. I love all of that. It's all so fun. And guess what? I'm going to go out on a limb and say that there's a pretty strong chance that I'm never going to become an NFL general manager. But it's still fun to go through this and analyze players and do all of it, right? But I also think that there comes a line where, all of a sudden you go through all of this and you watch your favorite player, you start reading about prospects and you start getting, fired up about a player that you want the Packers to take. And then they go in a different direction. You're like, how the hell could this happen? And things like that. And I want to start by saying there's a ton of really, really smart people out there that can cover the draft and watch film and are doing this 365 days a year. The Ben Fennells, the Daniel Jeremiahs, the Tony Paulines, Jordan Reed, Ben Solak, just to name a few. There are some that are doing tremendous, tremendous work. But even all of those have gaps in what they're looking for. And a reason for that is they're trying to cover 300 to 400 plus players over the course of a season in one draft cycle. And they're trying to do it for 32 teams. They don't have a specific team that they have in mind. And that's really, really tough for one person to do. NFL teams have entire scouting departments that, build up information and narrow down prospects and, get all the information up front so that they can build a case, and then general managers take that under consideration and so on and so forth. So for any one person to put together a 400 plus player draft guide, anything like that, it's really, really difficult to come close to what an NFL team would have at their disposal. And that's nothing against any of those people. They're doing amazing, tremendous work. But it still is far, far away from what an NFL team has at their disposal. Let me ask you this. As a NFL draft fan, which I'm assuming you are since you're listening today, I want you to think about your favorite player in this year's draft, somebody that you would love the Packers to take. Think about them for a second. Now, my next question is, how much do you know about that player? Have you read articles about the player? Have you maybe watched some YouTube clips, maybe some highlight videos? Have you actually watched maybe some film cut-ups that you can usually find on YouTube now for specific players? Have you watched interviews of that player online, maybe trying to see, how they are in an interview setting and trying to get a judge of their character as best you can? Have you checked their athletic thresholds? Have you reviewed their age, their improvement year over year? Have you looked into any off-field concerns that the player may have? Have you watched all 22 tape if you can actually find it? And if so, how many games have you watched of that one player? Do you understand their body type and body composition and what opportunity for growth that they have within their body? Have you reviewed their injury concerns? That's just a piece of it. For most of us, for most people, maybe they've done a couple of those things. They've read some articles, maybe a draft guide. Remember, She Said TV draft guide, cheap plug. But maybe you've done a couple of those things. Maybe you've done all of them. Maybe you've nerded out completely. And maybe you've done that for your, top 10, 15, 20, 30 players. But my guess is you probably haven't done all of that for 400, 500 players. And even if you have, all of that would pale in comparison, again, to what an NFL team has. And first and foremost, remember, they've got a general manager, VP of player personnel, VP of scouting, an entire scouting staff, scouts that are out on the road. Maybe not as much this year. I don't know how exactly it looked under a pandemic, but going to games, watching these players, interviewing coaches, all of it. And then, again, they capture all of that information and do it all together. Here's just a bit of information that NFL teams have and are doing better than what we as fans or analysts on the outside could possibly be doing. Even the best of the best of the best. They are doing tremendous amount of background checks. In fact, Daniel Jeremiah listed the reason that he got out of scouting and went into the media is because he can actually do more scouting of players, tape watching in that role than he can as an actual NFL scout, because so much of it has actually become background checks, interviewing coaches, interviewing past girlfriends and bartenders and, family members and cousins and all of it, and professors, to try to get as best of a player profile as you can possibly get. Are they good off the field? Are they good teammates? What's their work ethic like? Are they motivated by football? Do they care? Are they going to drop out? Are they going to fight through injuries? All of that stuff is actually becoming more important, because Daniel Jeremiah says this all the time. A lot of people can go and watch tape and tell you if a player is going to be good or not. That's mostly the easy part of the process. Whether or not they're going to reach the peak of their potential is much harder to figure out. And that personality profile and trying to figure out the background checks and things like that is actually much harder and a much bigger piece of the pie than any of us would like to actually admit to as we're going through this process. The next up is scheme fit. And that's a thing that's really tough, especially for Packer fans, is because we think we might have an idea of what I almost said Mike Patton, but what Joe Barry wants in this new Packers defense, but we don't have a great idea yet as to what he wants and what type of players he's specifically focusing on in that defense. And I asked Brian Gutekunst if things changed. He said maybe a little bit, but for the most part, he said they're still just looking for good players, obviously, but we don't exactly know what type of corners or edge rushers or whatever that they want in this Joe Barry defense. Now, the offense, we have a much better idea of what Matt LaFleur wants, but even then, as we look at this, it's tough to look at a player that you love and say, well, they're not going to fit exactly in Green Bay's scheme. Unless you have a great idea of that can be a tough thing to judge, whereas the team knows very, very much what players are going to fit in their specific schemes. We may have some access to, some sites are doing really great stuff with analytics, but it's going to pale in comparison to most of the top tier NFL teams, especially as they get hold of the next gen stats and the next gen data and stuff like that. They're just going to be on an entirely different level analytically than what we know, again, as fans or analysts. Locker room fit is something that teams are digging into much more than any of your favorite draft guides or anything like that. Positional depth in the draft is another thing you have to consider, and that might be something that you've played, in your mind and looked at it a little bit more in great detail. But take wide receiver in the 2020 draft. Like, yes, there was your Jerry Jeudy and your Henry Ruggs and those type of players towards the top of the draft, but CeeDee Lamb as well, but there was also depth towards the end of the first round, whether it was Justin Jefferson a little bit later, Jalen Reagor. We saw Michael Pittman go early second, Denzel Mims, et cetera, et cetera. And it was known as one of the best wide receiver drafts in a long time. So did you want to spend a premium pick on a first round wide receiver when maybe you could move down in the draft and get a Justin Jefferson, Jalen Reagor, Brandon Ayuk, maybe not with a top 10 pick, but with a 20 pick somewhere in there? Do you want to get one in the second round instead and get a Michael Pittman or a Denzel Mims instead? So the depth of the position can affect their thinking as they're trying to select and move around the draft and those sort of things as well. We also don't know each team's draft thresholds and overall draft philosophy. We have an idea with Brian Gutekunst. We know he has specific thresholds for specific players. We know that they very much value athleticism. Look at the RAS scores by Kentley Platty, and you see that they very much value high-end athleticism. 3 cones, very important for their offensive line as a short shuttle. Height is definitely important for their cornerbacks. Like, there's different thresholds that they have, but it's tough always to know those as you're trying to plot which player is going to go with which team. More exposure and better film. If you're not watching all 22, you're not watching what NFL teams are watching. And it's especially if you're looking at wide receivers, corner, safeties. If you're doing it without all 22, you might as well not be doing it in a lot of ways. And same thing with quarterback. Like, you've got to be able to see the entire field and what they're doing. And not only are teams watching that all 22 film, but more importantly, they're doing it year over year over year. They're watching this for some of these guys since high school, and they're ingrained in it year over year. They're seeing the year over year improvement. And more importantly, I don't have the ability when I'm watching all 22 film to ask a coach or to ask a player what was their responsibility on the play. NFL scouts do a lot of times when they go visit the college, they'll pump in the all 22 and they'll be able to ask a player or a coach what was supposed to happen on that play and get a better insight in detail as to what was actually going on. They're getting injury updates and actual medical information from actual team doctors, something we don't have access to. Also, these NFL scouts are insanely experienced. They know what they're looking at. They have a trained eye. I can tell you, as I mentioned earlier, I've been watching the draft and covering it in some capacity since age 9. Every single year, I take away something new as I'm watching film of prospects. Every year, I learn something new, period, bar none. So these scouts that have been scouting for 20, 30 years and have the ear of general managers and advanced scouts and people who've been doing this year upon year, like, they just have a more discerning eye for this stuff than, again, as most people do covering it, even the best of the best that are covering it in the media. historical trends. Russell Wilson's the classic example here. You hear all the time, and maybe it's revisionist history, but you hear all the time of how teams had loved Russell Wilson and had a really high grade on Russell Wilson. But no quarterback up until that point had any high level of NFL success with his height and his thresholds. And it's really tough to spend a first round pick on a player that has never had the type of player that's never had success in the NFL. So we may look at it now and say how ridiculous that it was that teams loved the player but wouldn't do it because of a height threshold. But those are real things that happen. Whether they should or shouldn't is up for debate. But those are real things that happen and real things that go into the decision as teams are evaluating these players. Maybe another one that goes completely underlooked, is that they have ideas of what future NFL drafts are going to look like. And they may know that, like, hey, let's not get a edge rusher in this draft, because edge rusher, defensive line are not great in this draft. But they may know that next year and the year after that the defensive line and edge rusher drafts are phenomenal. So they don't want to pump in a ton of high-end resources and draft picks now, which would limit them from not taking maybe one of those players in future drafts where it's going to be deeper at that position. Those are things that NFL teams know that, again, most of us do not. And then projecting future needs. Now, we can kind of see this as fans as what, long-term needs there are, but teams care about it much more than fans do. Most fans want to know what's going to help this team right now. And as you know, the Packers don't care about that. You don't have to look much further than last year's draft to understand that with a high level of understanding. So these are just a portion of the things that NFL teams have that we don't. Now, this is not in any way, shape, or form to give credit to NFL teams and say, like, with all this information, they're getting it right. They're not. I've literally, this is how nerdy I am. I've tracked for the last decade what I would have done if I was the Packers general manager. There are plenty of drafts where I hit much more than the actual Green Bay Packers did. There are others that I certainly did not. But it goes to show you that just how difficult this is and just how much of a crapshoot it can be is even with all that information I just laid out, NFL teams are far from perfect when it comes to evaluating prospects. So it's not to say that NFL teams have everything right. It's also not to say not to have fun with this and enjoy it and enjoy every aspect of this draft. But know that when you've built up this idea of a player that you would absolutely love your favorite team to take at whatever pick they take it at, and then they go in a different direction, know that they're making that educated decision based off of a insane more amount of data, experience, tape, everything than we could possibly imagine. So it doesn't mean they're going to get it right. It doesn't mean that we're wrong, but just know that they know a shit ton more than what we do. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I definitely think this is one of those less talked about topics throughout the season. So just wanted to kind of go over it today. I'll be back tomorrow probably breaking down some prospects with a much less discernible eye than what most NFL teams have, but I love doing it anyway, and I hope you will join me. Make sure to check out today's audio podcast wherever you get your favorite podcast. Just look up Pack a Day and it'll be there, I promise. I'll be right back here tomorrow, but until next time, and as always, go Pack Go.